And thank you all so much for joining us. It's such a pleasure to be with you today and to have this wonderful panel with us to talk about HR capabilities. My name is Amy Farner, and I lead the Global HR Capability Project for the Josh Bersin Company. And what that means is that I get to work with organizations and individuals on a regular basis to think about what are those HR capabilities that are most critical today and moving into the future. Where do we stand on those capabilities? And what do we do about it? How do we chart a course to develop the capabilities that are most critical for us as individual practitioners, but also for organizations in order to do everything that they need to do for the business? So let me start by just giving you a little bit of an overview of what we are doing within the project, and then let's dive into some of the question and answer. So our Global HR Capability Project is really founded on the Global HR Capability Model. It's a future-focused model of those functional and technical capabilities that we find are most critical for HR professionals and organizations. Josh and I started working on this, I think, about 2 years ago. It's been quite a journey that we've been on. And I think at one point we were north of 130 capabilities as we started thinking about what are those things that are important for HR professionals to focus on. So one of my big takeaways from that was that we as a profession are really focused on a really expanding and broad scope of very important work in service to our organizations. We ultimately landed on currently 94 capabilities that span 20 critical HR domains, and these cover the broad scope of work that is done by HR. One of the things that we are really committed to is that we update this model annually. We started working on this, as I said, 2 years ago. That was in a pre-COVID world. So I don't think we really had predicted how quickly things would be changing, but we certainly have kind of been happy that we've had the opportunity to really evolve the model and make sure that it does stay current. We looked at what was out there in the world. You know, one of the challenges that we have is that often we build these models and they sit on a shelf and they don't continue to keep pace with that rapid change. Now, based on that model, we've developed a suite of solutions to help individuals and organizations. The first of these is our Global HR Capability Assessment, which we built in partnership with Perceptix. This is a self-assessment tool that we've built that really is focused on understanding the professional experiences that have developed the capabilities for HR professionals. It's very easy to take. It takes about 15 minutes to complete. It's administered entirely online. But coming out of that assessment, we really have a wealth of information about individual capabilities as well as organizational capabilities. So for an individual who takes the assessment, they gain access to an individual capability profile. I think of this as their skyline. How do I look? Where do I peak? Where do I have greater degrees of capability? And where do I potentially have less experience and therefore less capability? They're able to compare that to a benchmark of global HR professionals. They can also trend that progress over time, as we know that we're all continuing to grow and develop capabilities. They also can access curated learning journeys within the Josh Bersin Academy to help them to build their capabilities in the highest priority areas for them. We also have a path that helps organizations, though. So there's really a balance, and I think we'll want to talk about this with the panel in a couple minutes, between, what do I need to do to develop as an individual in order to perform better in my current role, meet my career goals, kind of move on to that next step. But there also are things that organizations need to focus on in order to build their capabilities to meet their responsibilities to the business and all of the things that we need to do. Some of these are going to be common to organizations, and some are going to be very specific based on the strategy and the environment and the industry and all of the different things that are going on within the organization. So while the individual is able to pursue reviewing their capability profile, partnering with their manager to build out a development plan, accessing capability accelerators to build capability focused on their areas of focus, the organization can also look in aggregate across the results in order to see, well, what do we look like as an organization? Do we have the right capabilities in the right groups of individuals in order to do everything that we need to do? So we can look at where do our HR business partners stand? Where do our recruiters stand? And really understand what do those capability levels look like across the organization. And that gives some really, really compelling information. And from there, we often partner with organizations to build out what we call an enterprise capability roadmap. So where do we go as an organization? So while the individual is able to pursue their individual learning and development, what do we need to do in order to, as an organization, build that organizational capability, which includes both the individual capabilities of our HR practitioners, but also may include things like, are we following those best demonstrated practices that have proven effective at other organizations? Do we have the right technology and tools, policies, processes in place in order to be successful in our priority capability areas? So that's what we're doing within the Global Capability Project. But before we move on to our panel, just one more thing I wanted to share is our actual model. It's the foundation of what we do, and it absolutely is important to focus on. Now, this model is, as I said, 94 capabilities across 20 domains, but it is focused on those functional and technical capabilities of HR professionals. This is the work that we do. Now, there also is another component beyond functional and technical, which I think of as behavioral capabilities. And Freda, I'm going to want to ask you about this in a moment around, how you think about these as well. But, absolutely the functional and technical piece that you see here, we've got it kind of broken out into two rough categories. At the top in the lighter blue are HR functional domains. These may align with your centers of excellence or your functional teams within HR, things like talent acquisition, learning and development, labor relations. We have people whose entire job is to do these things. And at the bottom, in the darker blue, we have some of those things that we call our foundational or cross-cutting domains. These are things that are really kind of applicable no matter what your role is within HR. So we hope everyone has some business acumen, is helping to design solutions that support our workforce, is working with senior leaders in an effective way, and all of these other pieces. But one of the things I really like to emphasize when we look at this model is that these aren't silos. None of these are, exist where I can say, well, I'm a recruiter, and therefore I need to really focus and play in that talent acquisition space. And beyond that, I'm good. I don't really need to focus on all of these other pieces. We really focus on this more as something aligned with that T-shaped development model. So if I am a recruiter, yep, I certainly need to have some deeper capability in that talent acquisition space. But I also need to have some understanding, some fluency, some comfort with all of these other areas as well. So for example, in the compensation space, I need to understand how we benchmark our compensation to the market so that I can put out offers that are compelling and meaningful to candidates. I need to certainly have a lot of comfort in employee experience and what that experience will be like for the candidates that I bring in. I need to understand our benefits and well-being programs and packages. I don't need to design them, but maybe I need to be sitting at that table saying, I understand how these work, and I'm able to translate that into the work that I do. So this is the model that we're using. And, as I'm partnering with organizations on building their HR capabilities, there's one of the things that I'm impressed by every day is how much we're learning. So, organizations that I'm working with, I often talk to individuals who have taken the assessment. They say, I learned so much. Going into this, I wasn't sure where I wanted to focus my development next year. And after taking the assessment, I get it. This is my development plan. It was much easier to do that. I work with organizations and they say, well, we've learned so much because, wow, we didn't realize that as we looked across our organization, the distribution of capabilities is not really even. And we need to think about how we're supporting our workforce across business units, across regions in a different way, and how we're building that capability across our organization. But one of the things that I think is also really exciting is thinking broadly about the HR profession and how we are able to really get a window into what the profession looks like from a capability perspective. So we have had over 5,500 HR professionals globally who have completed the assessment, and we're seeing all kinds of really interesting trends coming out about, well, what role does people analytics play across different HR roles? So how do we kind of focus that people analytics capability, which is something that a lot of HR professionals tell us is not a native, not really one of those things that they came into the field comfortable with. We're learning about the importance of coaching, which is one of our highest performing HR capabilities, and also one that HR professionals value very much for their own personal development. We're learning about DEI capability and how it looks not just within the DEI team, which often is a relatively small team within many organizations, but what might a DEI capability look like across everyone in the HR organization and how that can contribute to the effectiveness of DEI programs. So lots of really exciting things that are coming out of that aggregate data. And what I'm really excited about on today's panel is the opportunity for me to take a step back and learn from some of the great minds that are also thinking about this as well. So with that said, maybe we can take the slides down. I'd love to do a very quick introduction of the other folks that we have in the conversation, and then give them a moment to introduce themselves as well. So I'm going to go in the order in which I'm seeing folks on my screen. So I'll say that I first see Dr. Freda Pauly, who is the CEO and founder of Pymetrics. Thanks for joining us, Freda. And next I see Josh. Josh Bersin is a global industry analyst, and he is the CEO of the Josh Bersin Company. So a familiar face to me, certainly. Next, I see Monet Valenzuela. Monet is the Senior Director of Talent Development for PVH. And I believe our final panelist is Shivani Gopal, who is the Vice President of Human Resources for Risk Solutions at LexisNexis. So thank you so much for joining us. What I'd love to do now is turn it over to you all to just talk a little bit, just introduce yourselves with a little bit more detail. And perhaps as we do so, I'd love to hear a little bit more around, we'll maybe start with Monet and Shivani, the work that you're doing around HR capability within your organizations. So Monet, would you like to go ahead and get us started?
Would love to. Thank you, Amy. Hello and happy Friday to everyone. Monet Valenzuela, Senior Director of Talent Development at PVH. Under my scope, I oversee leadership and functional academies, one of which is HR Academy. For those of you that are not quite familiar with PVH, we have a longstanding history of 140 years plus and counting. We are a fashion company powered by global iconic brands such as Calvin Klein and Tommy Hilfiger. And we reach consumers across the globe, across 40 countries, and are made up of 30,000 associates that are committed to drive fashion forward for good. Prior to being at PVH, I've had time focusing on talent development strategies in an international cross-brand and multi-industry environments, such as Michael Kors and DFS Luxury Travel Retail. And I think you asked us to also say, what are we excited about to be here? And I'm excited to be able to have the opportunity to be in a room, obviously with Josh Bersin, but also with other professionals in the HR community to figure out where we're at, talk about where we want to go, and learn of how we can get there through an amazing tool like the capability assessment. We recently launched it to our global community, which is made up of 500 HR associates, to really understand and tap into the ability to balance empowering our associates to design their future, but also getting that rich data to make informed decisions on where we're at in that HR transformation journey. And you talked about the importance of coaching, and that it's a secret sauce to a great leader, to an extraordinary leader. And I think this capability assessment provides that information for us to make the investment in the associates and where we need to drive our learning capabilities. And it tells us what our results are, where our population wants to focus, but also how they want to learn it. So really thrilled to be here with all of you.
Thanks so much, Monet. And there were so many great things in what you said. I heard a lot about, figuring out where you are and where you want to go, as well as that balance between empowering associates, but also driving the learning capabilities that you need as an organization, which is so critical. So I think we'll definitely want to revisit that as well. But next, why don't we move to Shivani? Can you please give us a quick introduction and where you are on your capability journey?
Of course. Thank you, Amy. And hello, everyone. So excited to be here. My name is Shivani Gopal, and I am the Vice President of Human Resources with the LexisNexis Risk Solutions Group, with our parent company being Relics, based out of London. And we have within our organization, within the Risk Solutions Group, we have approximately 10,000 employees. And I support, in my team, 1,200 of those based out of multiple geographic locations. And it's been very exciting partnering with the Josh Bersin Company because our HR organization is actually going through a transformation very similar like our business partners. If we think about what businesses have experienced over the last 24 months and how customers and consumers have been impacted, there's a much more refined focus on the execution of the business and organizational transformation. And if you think about that from a talent standpoint, this is really our moment to shine as HR partners. The labor shortage, as well as with where work gets done, has directly really impacted these transformations. And so the HR capability assessment hasn't come at a better time for us as an organization, because what it's allowed us to do is really take a minute to pause and reflect and assess the skills that we need as HR practitioners to determine how we can better support our organizations and really identify those true critical capabilities and skills that we're going to need to help them moving forward. So it's really exciting time for us, but it's also an opportunity for us to learn from each other, and it's really exciting to be here with all of you.
Great, thank you so much, Shivani. And you know, hearing about your transformation, I think we'll definitely want to delve into that a little bit more as well, and how that's affected your HR capability strategy. Next, if I can ask Freda for you to do a quick introduction, and you know, perhaps you can talk a little bit about what you've been on at Pymetric specific to HR as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Amy, for the floor. So, pleasure to be here. I'm Dr. Freda. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Pymetric. Prior to Pymetric, I was a cognitive scientist at Harvard and MIT, and all of the behavioral capabilities that we've developed really leverage very new, cutting-edge cognitive science behavioral profiling, which, again, the advantage to doing it in a different way, different than sort of more traditional paper and pencil type soft skills assessment, is essentially the way that we think about individuals in a cognitive science framework is far less, sort of essentially is far less likely to have racial and gender bias. So just that's one thing to keep in mind. But even more than that, is very modular and fit-based. So I think historically capability modeling from the behavioral piece of things in any case has really tried to be much more of a one-size-fits-all. People will say, oh, if you're smart, conscientious, and agreeable, that's going to make you a great, a great fit everywhere. And if you're not, then, that's a challenge. The fit-based approach that cognitive science allows for, which is much more modular, really allows fit to role, not only fit to role, but also fit to some of these new capabilities that I think a lot of organizations are trying to access. And so, Amy, we talked about this. I think there are sort of three things that make somebody a great fit for any particular role. One is absolutely the hard skill capabilities that you and Josh at GBA have developed this wonderful tool for. The second thing is sort of motivations and interests. That's, usually organizations will have their own way of capturing that. And then the third thing is really this aptitudinal fit or soft skill fit. And, there's been tons of research showing that assessing all three of those, aspects is really what drives, best performance. And so our focus really has been on how can we leverage all of the data we have now across, millions of folks who've been through the system, across, hundreds of different companies, to really understand what are the different HR profiles from a behavioral capability standpoint. And then how do they map to certain things that people are really interested in learning about these days, right? So for example, we had this really interesting project we did with another group showing how HR professionals do and do not map to a digital potential capability. Everyone's always talking about digital potential. How do you measure that? How do we fit our people to that? And I think, again, if we have a little bit of time later, I'd love to actually talk to you how HR professionals on average do or do not fit to digital potential, because there's actually a much greater fit than you would think from a behavioral standpoint. And then there's one particular area where there's like a bit of a mismatch. And so that was fascinating and led to all sorts of really interesting work that we're now doing with organizations. So again, I think that the lens that, JBA's capability framework brings is incredibly critical. And then I think, supplementing that also with more of a soft skills or an aptitudinal or behavioral capability really sort of rounds out the picture. And we just love the work that allows for us. So.
That's wonderful. Thanks, Freda. And I do want to go back to, we'll come back to the digital.
Yeah,
I have a lot of questions about that one. But next, I did want to move to Josh. And Josh, if you can just do a quick introduction. I think most folks on the call probably are familiar with you, and maybe talk about, what prompted you 2 years ago to say, Amy, can we figure this out?
Well, you were there, Amy, you remember. Yeah, I mean, this has been really a passion project for Amy and me for 2 years or more. And the way it all started was many, many years of research and consulting with a lot of you, and hearing over and over again, teach me more about that thing that you did the research on. And we realized that what's been happening in HR is the same thing that's been happening in every other profession. It's become a hybrid job. Specialized roles are not so specialized anymore. As Amy said, you can't do recruiting without knowing something about diversity and pay, and you can't do pay without knowing something about recruiting and the job market, and it goes on and on and on. So we developed this assessment. It's been tested with a lot of companies, hundreds of companies now, and it's not a behavioral assessment like Pymetrics. And so at some point we are going to do something with Freda. We haven't quite done it yet, and we'll figure out the behavioral side of HR. But I think the thing that it probably brings more than anything else is not only an inventory of where your company and your organization is strong and weak and the inconsistencies, but it shows you, sort of you don't know what you don't know. It exposes you to things in HR that you weren't even aware of, potential areas to spend time. And there's about 20 million HR people in the world. It's not a giant number, but you have huge impact on organizations. As you know, the recruiting, the learning, the strategy work that HR people do affects, thousands and thousands of employees. So we're really excited to bring this forward. And the reason we call it a project, by the way, is it is an ongoing exercise. And so as we work with each one of you and you say, hey, what about this thing? And Amy and I are like, we didn't think about that. Well, so let's think about where that fits. So we're constantly exploring, and we will try to keep it up to date year over year.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much, everyone, for those introductions. And I feel like I've got tons of follow-up questions. So I'm going to dive right in with a couple of those. So I want to return to something that that Monet brought up in her comments around this balance between empowering associates, but also driving the learning capabilities that are necessary for the organization. This is something that I hear, a lot from organizations that I work with on this, and it is absolutely a tension there. So maybe we can start with Monet and Shivani. If you guys can talk a little bit about kind of what does that look like within your organization, and how do you prioritize what do we need as an organization, and balance that with what do our individuals and what passions do they want to pursue in their HR careers? Shivani, would you mind starting us off?
Yeah, sure. So I think we're at such a critical juncture at the moment, because when you talk about HR capabilities, very much to yours and Josh's point, that there's so much out there as HR practitioners that we are expected to be able to deliver for our customers and for our business partners. But it's also being able to balance that with identifying where our own interests lie and aspirations. And I would tell you that I think right now, the biggest opportunity for us is really from a change agent standpoint, and empowering our HR practitioners and professionals to be able to have really an opportunity to step up and help our leaders and our employees navigate through the unknown as we're ourselves sort that out as well, right? So being able to really function in that space, and it's quite a nebulous space, which is that in itself is quite daunting, but being able to build that capability is, I think, what's really going to be able to distinguish and differentiate your talent, and really from an employer of choice standpoint, being able to help develop and promote that employee experience and the role that HR plays in that.
Absolutely. And I think that's one that, given where you are in your HR transformation, that makes perfect sense to me.
One thing, Amy, can I interrupt 1 sec? You might want to mention the project we did with the company in Asia on the business impact of HR capabilities at some point. I don't want to jump the gun, but.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, why don't I can give a quick overview. I don't want to hide the ball either. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about that. And I think it very much aligns, Shivani, with what you were sharing around the impact on the employee experience. So one of the early organizations that we partnered with is a large financial services organization that's headquartered in Asia. And they took the capability assessments for their HR professionals, and then they took the data back and they said, well, how does this look compared to other data sources that we have within our organization? And what they found was that there was incredibly strong alignment of HR capabilities with other business outcomes that they really cared about. So for example, when they looked at the capabilities of their recruiters, specific to their recruiting capabilities, what they found is that those business units that were served by higher capability recruiters reported lower first-year turnover amongst newly hired employees, which says that maybe those recruiters who have higher capabilities are in fact getting those better outcomes. They're getting better fit candidates. They're doing a better job of really kind of translating what does it look like in reality to work at this organization. They also, though, were able to align the results with their employee survey as well. And that gave some really interesting outputs across all of those different components of the employee experience. So, for example, where they had higher capability across their HR team, they tended to see higher, more positive results in their employee survey. So, for example, communication was an area that was a stronger capability for their HR organization, and it also came out as a stronger area for in terms of the satisfaction of their employees on the employee survey. So they really were able to kind of draw that line between how does the capability of HR professionals affect every component of the employee experience. It's not just the people who are working in EX who are driving it, but the HR generalists who are working on those transactions, and the HR business partners who are aligned with the business, the recruiters who are working with candidates. They're really touching every bit of that employee experience, and they're seeing the impact of that based on how well they're able to and how capable they are in those areas.
Yeah, the one point I would just add to that is we're going to talk a lot about developing HR skills and the behavioral skills and so forth. The big message here is great companies have great HR functions. Mm-hmm. Companies that don't have great HR functions tend to have other problems. So this is a business assessment, not just an HR assessment.
Yeah. I agree wholeheartedly. And Josh, I think that brings us, kind of more around that idea of this being a little bit more of an empowering and kind of bottoms up approach where, historically, we've often said from the top, this is what we need. We've got a little bit more meat in the middle here now as well. And Monet, I think that aligns with some of the work you're doing at PVH where, I think you have, a really great program around how folks can build their career within the organization based on what they're looking for. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So our goal when building the HR Academy, which took also about 2 years to get up and off the ground, was to really be able to enhance the capabilities of our global HR community and support the strategic business priorities and how HR can add value to that. And I think, again, just reinforcing this tool, it allows us to have insight as individuals and where we want to take our HR professional careers and be able to get a individualized learning report that provides programs and resources for that ongoing development, but also, as you said, aggregate findings for us to tap into how does this align to our power plans? Where can we empower and really create some autonomy for our associates to put that in the driver's seat? We have done a lot of learning needs analysis from a global scale, both in the retail population as well as the corporate office of, how easy is a user experience for the platforms that we have learning all together? And we don't know where to start. There's great information. And what the JV company does provide is that opportunity. Where do I lead in first? Where could I start to reach my individual goals, but also provide that collective insight as an organization? Where can we have continued collective learning opportunities for us to jump into a program, learn those foundations, but then tie it all together with pausing and saying, how does this apply to PVH? How can we take those theories and create action to really drive the performance that we want to see?
Yeah, you guys are doing some really interesting things there. And I think you're also building that translation to PVH context into your badging and credentialing of these opportunities as well, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, so we love the idea of them being able to get the certificates issued by the Josh Bersin Academy. But what we're trying to do is, again, create continuous learning, and those individualized reports or accelerator reports, if you will provide those programs that are bundled with those resources. And so we're looking at digital badges within the organization to really promote ongoing and building upon the existing skills. Because as you said, it's a project, it's ever going. We're going to have continuous skills that we need to tap into as organizations want to drive into the future.
Wonderful. Well, Freda, I want to switch back over to you because you were talking a little bit about the research that you've done around behavioral capabilities for HR professionals. And I think that's aligned with a lot of what we're doing, what we're talking about here when we think about change agency and we think about kind of all of these different, how do we bring that learning back into the organization? And you mentioned that, I'm looking down at my notes here, and so you can correct me if I misspeak, but what you found was that, surprisingly, HR professionals in your data set actually showed a good fit for digital potential.
Yes.
And that was a surprise to me because, we've done some research on, what does this look like for, when you think about HR technology capabilities, people analytics capabilities, that's the number one question that I get asked about is how do we create a more data literate HR workforce? So I am dying to hear about this because I think these are hard things to teach. So tell me, what are we doing here?
Absolutely. And so is it easy to share my screen on WebEx? Is it as simple as just hitting the share my screen? Because I want to just show you guys. Showing is always more fun than telling. How does that sound to folks?
That sounds great. Do you have? I'm not sure if you have a presenter role.
I don't either.
Check if Freda has a presenter.
Yeah, let's get.
Freda, I did pass you the presenter's ball.
You did? Okay, great. It looks like I'm having to do something on, oh dear, I wonder, it might be, let's see if I can do this. Otherwise, I can just tell I don't need to show, although it would be so much more fun. Let's see if I can do this or not. No, you know what? Oh, I don't think I have WebEx sharing enabled. Okay, so I'll just speak to it. It's fine. So basically, we measure, 9 different what we call factors or capabilities. They range across a spectrum of, cognitive, social, and emotional aptitudes. We look at things, like decision making, for example. We also look at things like learning ability. We look at, a whole bunch of things, including attention, effort, risk tolerance, emotional style, generosity, and focus. And again, those then can be you can double click into each of those. We call them factors, but you could think of them almost as capabilities, these soft skill capabilities. And, in each of these, you can essentially double click and there are multiple different levels of these that we measure. So what we then did as a team, as we said, digital potential is something that people are so interested in understanding, at a deeper level. So what are the behavioral attributes of digital potential? And we that was the first research study that we did. We said, what are the things that define digital potential? And there were really 3 aspects of these behavioral capabilities that we learned through our research factored onto digital potential. So again, one was learning, right? So you can imagine that learning is a critical component of digital potential. And the way we measure learning is, on a spectrum from, what we call consistent learning, which is more methodical and I wouldn't say plotting, but it's like more methodical, all the way to adaptive, which is like learning agility. And as you can imagine, the digital potential profile was more on the adaptive learning style. That makes sense. The second thing, the second factor that loaded onto digital potential was focus. So again, focus ranges from multitasking to single focus, right? And again, not huge surprise, the digital potential capability loaded onto multitasking, right? You can switch easily between different activities. And the third thing that we found loaded onto digital potential was decision making. So decision making, again, can be ranges from a spectrum of deliberative to instinctive. So deliberative is what it sounds like. Again, it's more planned, and instinctive is more what we think of intuitive or gut-based decision making, right? So I'm going to open it up. So I'm going to preface it by saying that HR professionals actually matched the digital potential profile. And the digital potential profile, just to remind everyone, found that people with high digital potential were adaptive in their learning style as opposed to consistent. They were good at multitasking as opposed to single focused, and they were deliberative in their decision-making style as opposed to instinctive. So I'm going to open this up to the panel. So the HR profile mapped to 2 of those features, but not a third. So does anyone want to guess across adaptive learning, multitasking focused, and deliberative decision making, which of the 2 mapped to the HR profile and which did not?
I'd like you guys to guess first.
Come on, come on.
I think HR people are instinctive.
Bing! That's exactly right. So HR professionals were absolutely adaptive in their learning style. They were absolutely good at multitasking, but where they didn't map to the digital potential profile was the fact that they are more instinctive in their decision-making style than deliberative. So Josh, you get the award for the correct answer. Yay. It means you know your HR professionals really well. So that was just really interesting, right? So now that we can go into an organization and say, if you are looking for to develop digital potential, and again, you can define this in multiple ways. This is what our research found. I'm sure there's other ways you can, slice and dice the data, but that's sort of how we found. And so then in that case, then how do you help? And so the good news is that, HR professionals are more aligned with digital potential than anyone maybe would have thought from the get-go, right? Because HR is not a field that historically has been sort of, asked to use a lot of digital tools. So actually, I think that's the good news. That's the takeaway. And then if we want to think about, okay, well, how can we align, digital potential with more of an instinctive learning style? Because I don't think you're necessarily going to force HR professionals to be more deliberative, because I think being instinctive in HR is like critical to what you need to do, right? You need to be able to read a situation, to understand people's emotions well, like, and all of that good stuff. So you're not going to all of a sudden start, trying to teach HR professionals to necessarily be more deliberative, but how can you take that digital potential capability and adapt it for folks that are potentially more on the instinctive learning spectrum? So I thought that was really fascinating. I'm happy to share the piece of work. It's a whole sort of report that we did. Happy to share it with the audience afterwards if that's interesting, but I'll leave it at that and see if this is a discussion starter for the panel, because we thought it was fascinating work.
And I think it's fascinating too, because it is such an empowering message. And I think that so often, when people come and say, we want to build the technology capability and the people analytics capability within our HR workforce, and they say, well, it's not a native capability. It's not a native skill. It's too hard to teach.
Exactly. Yep.
One of the things, Amy, I wanted to ask, the other folks about is, almost every company has some digital capability strategy,
yep,
whatever you call it. And what I find in HR is it's not, and this is in our model, it isn't like learning a mean or a median or how to write software or how to use Excel. It's storytelling. It's using data in a meaningful way, because most of what HR people do is about people and interpreting data. And I'm curious, the other thing, I want to ask you guys that question. And the other question is something that I've always noticed in HR, is there's, in a sense, these tribes. Amy and I call them tribes. The recruiters sort of come from the salesy people. The learning and development people come from education backgrounds. The operations people come from finance and accounting, and so there's also this issue of those personalities. And I'm curious if you guys, and I think that's why I think people should move around in HR, is to see the other side and appreciate it. But I'm curious, if you guys see those themes in your data.
So if I can answer that really quickly, Josh. So that's another thing that we did in this paper, is we looked at exactly, we call them roles, you can call them tribes. And indeed, we found that, while we had sort of built an HR generalist profile, there were then these sort of subcultures or tribes. And absolutely, the aptitudinal capabilities that you described mapped very well to what you just outlined, right? So for example, people that were in sort of more HR operations role were less instinctive, right? Because think about it, they come from finance or accounting. They're like more by the books, right? Anyway, so it's fascinating that you mentioned that, because that's what our data showed. And then the other thing I just want to, link back to is, I think this is why behavioral capability modeling is so important as well, right? Because Amy and Josh, to your point, people think of digital potential and they think of skills. They think of, oh, can what are the hard skills that map to that? And those are not things that HR professionals are going to have a strong background in. If you look at the behavioral capabilities, that's where you really learn, hey, there's actually a much bigger overlap. So these are the types of instances where I think where behavioral capabilities are so important in making that bridge to something which may not be correctly mapped from a sort of a hard skills perspective, onto what the capability really means from a sort of a personality and cognitive style. Anyways, I'll pause there, but this is such fascinating work.
Yeah, it really is. If I can ask, Shivani, Monet, I'd love to hear from your perspectives around the digital capability strategy for your organization and how you're seeing that within your HR folks. Maybe, Shivani, would you mind starting us?
I'd love to. This is a topic that actually really hits home for us because my company is a data analytics company. We provide data insights to our customers so they can make informed decisions. So by nature, the intrinsic value for our own business partners who are our customers is that they're used to the storytelling because that's what they deliver, the service they deliver to our customers, right? And whenever we take the opportunity to use our external market insights, and again, this is where the Josh Bersin company has been so helpful in helping us connect those dots for our own business and trying to just get an assessment of what is happening in the market at the moment. So looking at the external market insights, looking at internal insights, whether it's your employee opinion survey, attrition trending, exit survey data, any set of data points you want to take, and being able to help them connect the dots to make an informed talent strategy. And so in terms of just how we're approaching it, we're very much, I think we've got an opportunity just as part of our HR transformation to leverage data in a more meaningful way. But a lot of the initial work in getting our managers to think that way, it's already been done for us because our talent provide, like I said, to our customers. So it's very fascinating. And there was a comment that Josh made earlier that I wanted to just piggyback off of is around great companies having great HR professionals. Great companies, great HR professionals, and great managers. Think about these tribes around where do you typically where you might see a profile of HR professionals based on their skill sets. A lot of times strong HR partners have prior management experience on the commercial side of the business because they've basically been operating with on the business side, working with employees. And so when they have an opportunity to rotate within the HR organization, it really lends itself well in terms of having that customer experience and bringing it into the HR organization to get us to start thinking, putting ourselves in their shoes and really understanding what keeps employees and managers up at night. So when you've got very strong manager capability enablement, that's also a reflection that you've got a very strong HR team.
Yeah, I agree. Those are also important. And I love, what you're saying about the rotational and actually putting yourself in the shoes, doing the work. That's so critical. It really is, we think of that as core to capability development. Monet, can you talk a little bit about that from the PVH side as well?
Definitely. And I do want to preface, I joined the organization March 2020. So I am learning a lot of the capabilities that are happening in a virtual world. But I would say that we have a lot of great resources in our HR community that we can pull from. So there's a lot of data, but not necessarily the data talking to each other or really building the storytelling and how we're able to communicate this to the audience. And I feel like the capability assessment allows us to not assume where our group is at, but actually get really clear on what it is that they're assessing themselves. And then looking at because we've had a huge transformation. We have a new chief people officer, we have a new CEO. So we have really pivoted in the transformation and where we want to go as a business. And so if we look at what are our key priorities that we want, and we're able to tell our associates, and they have a clear understanding of where they're at and how they can contribute. So contribute to their individual development, but also contribute to the overall focuses of the business. And that's where, again, it's a win-win for us to say, okay, this is how you want to learn. Now we need to provide those learning opportunities for you and for the business to get to where we want to go. And so I think that we have the data, it's understanding how we want to read, use, and share that to help continue to break down the silos.
Amy, can I add a point on this?
Absolutely.
One of the things I want everybody on the webinar to think about is this is a very complex profession. The 94 things that we found are each complicated. They each take years of experience to be good at. And you're not going to be a great HR person in 2 years. You could develop software you could learn how to develop software in 6 months, but you're not going to learn how to do HR in 6 months. So one of the things I want people to think about is respecting the depth of value that HR people provide. And that's the reason we did this assessment. Number two, the fact that you build it over many years, lots of experiences, lots of companies, lots of jobs, lots of projects. And the third is that something that sort of seems obvious that comes out of this data, when you do these kinds of projects and you look at this kind of data, you have the opportunity to go to the CFO, the CEO, whoever the business counterpart and say, look, this investment in the HR team paid off. We got better people, we got better performance, we got better results. And that's why we're doing it. It isn't just skills development. It's more than that. And so I just wanted to sort of make that comment, including the behavioral side. I mean, that is, if you're a great recruiter, you're probably not going to be super interested in working in the HR IT department doing reports. That's my guess. You might, probably not.
I think you're right on that one, Josh. It's back to the tribes, so yeah.
Yeah, and I think that is an important point, Josh, and that complexity and that it is not necessarily, these aren't necessarily easy capabilities to develop brings me to one of the questions, there are a couple questions in the chat that I just want to pull out for the group. One is, what are the risks to accomplishing our critical HR capabilities? So, what are the challenges that Monet, Shivani, you may have hit, or that Freda, Josh, you've seen out there in the world? And I think that complexity, Josh, is certainly one of them. It's not a short and easy path to develop these capabilities. But if I can just open it up to the group, what else have you seen as potential risks?
Well, I'll add my thought on the risk, and now you guys got me going here. I think people underappreciate the complexity and depth of this job. I really think business people think HR is easy. Mm-hmm. And so they will not give you the time or money or maybe resources you need to develop these skills. And I'm not saying every company's like that. I mean, there's lots of companies that aren't like that. But in Silicon Valley, where I live, I can't tell you how many people that think HR is basically recruiting, and that's it. And that's all they think about. And then, then they get to be a big company. They're like, well, how come we have this turnover problem? And how come we have this training problem? These were things you probably could have thought about a few years ago. So I think that's the risk. And, I think our job in our company is to give you the ammunition to have those conversations with your counterparts so you get the resources that you need. And because a lot of companies don't have HR universities, they don't have HR academies, they don't have anything. Most companies have nothing.
Yeah, I think that's right. There's the risk that's the complexity, but also a secondary risk, which is the underappreciation of that complexity from the rest of the business. If I can ask Shivani, Monet, Freda, any other risks that you've seen?
Yeah, I think as organizations scale and grow, the function of HR is evolving. It certainly is in my company. And we are doing a disservice to our business by taking a much more reactive approach when it comes to HR support. A lot of times, as businesses are growing, they're very quick to scale, and they want to tell HR, I need you to go and execute on X, Y, and Z. And it's absolutely critical that we have strong operational execution. But it's also critical that we're able to anticipate some of the business needs, which is why having a strong business acumen is so important, right? Regardless if you're in TA, especially now, TA, learning development, understanding what are those critical capabilities and being able to translate when you're in a strategy session with the business, what does that mean from a talent implication, a talent perspective? And so the risk really is that keeping organizations honest and helping them not only achieve, but also the art of the possible. What else should we be thinking about that we traditionally look to HR to just go and execute? but what is something that HR actually could be bringing to the table that they hadn't thought about before, right? And I will just also note, there's just a general risk for HR professionals at the moment. It's fatigue. We are being pulled in so many different directions, and we're used to being able to answer questions on the fly, to the point around having instinct. And right now it's tough to do that when you don't have all the answers, right? And so I think that's frankly just a risk in general for the HR organization, is being able to navigate through that too, and the fatigue we have to acknowledge for ourselves.
Yep. And one thing that I think is a risk is not, because of this potential perception and self-perception of HR professionals that, we're not digitally native, we're not digitally savvy, we're not used to dealing with data, for example, of some, trepidation on their part to actually look at all of the different data, that are available now, right? I mean, there's all sorts of technology platforms, Pemetrix just being one of them, but, we talked about employee engagement platforms and, there's just so many different platforms now that can provide such rich and easy to use and easy to access data that I think, I would encourage the HR function to really, I understand, it's traditionally a cost center and blah, 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 but to really make the business case for how can you possibly operate a company, any function of the company without data, right? And I think that for too long, HR professionals have been put in the situation of oh, just do your job, but, don't ask for investment in your function because, you're a cost center. But that's very sort of reactive to the earlier point. So it's really making the business case that with additional data, right, whether it's around the capability modeling, JVA, or any type of data, we can actually build better HR teams and we can get better business outcomes, right? So really encouraging, I think, the HR function to advocate for themselves and become strategic.
Let me add one more thing that Shivani mentioned that I wanted to point out. In that big Asian company that we talked about earlier, we saw huge differences in HR capabilities in different business units. I mean, massive differences. If you had that data in a big company and you knew that this business unit's growing like crazy, it needs to do a lot of hiring, this business unit's going through a turnaround, you could move HR people around.
Yep.
But if you don't have that data, you don't know. So I think that's another opportunity here to manage HR in an even more strategic way.
Yep.
Yeah, and if I can just jump in and talk about a challenge that we actually faced during our focus group mode was, how is the HR community going to embrace the word assessment, especially when we were going through such a time of change? The first, our HRLT, so our human resource leadership team, gave us a little pushback because of previous assessments that were thrown out there and how that was going to be perceived by our HR community. Like, is my job at risk if I am scoring low on whatever this report pushes out? And what are you getting from that corporate level from this report that you're going to use? And am I at risk? And it was really important to get our chief people officer involved as we launched the capability assessment, to reinforce that it's optional, to reinforce that's anonymous, and to reinforce that even her, as the chief people officer and her experiences, that we all have strengths and we all have areas of opportunity. This is a tool and a resource that will really help us all grow and improve together. Because as you said, we need to have hybrid capabilities, Josh, at the top of the call. And this allows us to keep improving where we are really awesome and then tap into, we have a little area of opportunity.
We had a big debate about whether to call it an assessment. And one of the things we did talk about was calling it an inventory, so you don't feel quite so judged. Because it isn't really a judgmental assessment. It's really more of an inventory. But I agree with you, Monet. We don't want people to feel like this is a threat.
And I think one of the things that we've had to really kind of reinforce in our communications as we talk to HR professionals about taking this and organizations, we're so in the mindset of like, our goal is to top out the scale, right? I should want to push everything to a 5. So one of the things that recipients, that participants receive is that they get a skyline that shows kind of what's my shape look like in terms of where I peak and where I valley. And we really have to reinforce, your goal is not to push everything over to the highest possible level. That's not possible. There's going to be, and just as Freda, Josh, we talked a little bit about those tribes and that idea. For different tribes, you're going to have a different shaped skyline. Some of us are going to look like New York, and some of us are going to look like Chicago, and some of us are going to look like Hong Kong. And it just depends on where have you been in your career and where are you going in your career and what do you need to get there.
Yep. Yeah, and I just want to tie it back to the final thing, which is I think, again, we need to move away from this idea that assessment is a one-size-fits-all. That's a very, very dated view. And it is how, if you think about like the Hogan dark side, right? It's a whole bunch of things that you shouldn't be, right? That's not a fit-based assessment. That's an assessment that says, it's judging you, essentially. It's telling you what you should and shouldn't be. And again, I think those are, more indicative of the way we used to think about people like 40 years ago when the Hogan was developed, as opposed to the way we think about people now, which is much more fit-based, which is everybody has a fit somewhere. There's no such thing as a good person and a good employee and a bad one, right? That's just very dated. And I think we need to sort of educate the field that fit-based assessments really are much more modern and sort of in with the times where, I think our belief is that, we have to build inclusive companies where everyone, has a productive role, so.
I think that's a really positive note for us to close on because it does look like we are just about at time. But I do just want to take a moment to thank you all so much for joining us today to talk about this topic. It's something that I'm certainly passionate about and spend a lot of time thinking about. And I love seeing the passion from you all and hearing about your experiences and what you've learned in this field as well. I just want to flag that, we do have more information about our HR capability project available on our website at joshbersin.com. And I think that we can put the link to that in the chat as well. And finally, I just want to thank HR Executive for hosting us for this session. It has been so wonderful to talk with you all this morning and to hear all of your perspectives. So I appreciate everyone for contributing to make it such a great session.